Hello, good morning. I would like to dedicate my talk to Jo, who is one of the organizers of this conference, and he's a really good friend, and he's been having a really hard time personally. So I wanted to say heads up to Jo, and if you see him, give him a hug. He's a really amazing guy, as I'm sure all of you know. Yeah. Thank you for coming and thank you for inviting me to speak. I feel a bit like the odd one out because I'm not a type designer and I don't know much about type design. But I've brought a talk with me in response to the theme of the conference, Legacy. And it's called Layered Legacy. And this is what I think about when I think about layers. And it's more and more how the shape of my practice is becoming. I'm a graphic designer, but also a publisher. I also teach, and I also am doing a PhD. And we have 2 young kids, and all of that together is like a total jungle. And it can look nice from the outside, but it can be really hard to bite into. It can give you indigestion. But I'll try to. So my talk is gonna kind of go through all the different aspects of what I do. And I looked up the word legacy and found one of the definitions was something left or handed down by a predecessor. And I thought it was a really nice thing to think about. So I split the talk up into 3 sections, how legacy is present in my work. And the first one is how it's being your own predecessor when you're practicing graphic designer, and I'm sure this is for a type designer too. And you've been going for a while, like me, I've been working for 15 years. How do you deal with the stuff you've done, and how do you keep renewing yourself? And when I started out, I always said, I don't want to have a style, but you do start noticing things that you do, and how can you keep questioning yourself and pushing yourself? The second one is how do you deal with other people's legacy? When you're a graphic designer, you use other people's typefaces, or there are other people who have made identities before you that you have to update or rebrand, and how do you deal with that in your work? And then the last one is a bit of my current research, which is about graphic design in Belgium in the 60s and 70s. So, being your own predecessor. And this is an example of a friend of mine. He's called Will Holder and Stuart Bailey, 2 people, who designed a magazine called Metamorphosis a while ago. And they made this template whereby the text is always in the middle, and then their design is to add footnotes around it. And they've been reusing their own template. So not being scared of recycling yourself. Because in graphic design, we're always completely obsessed with the new and the coolest and the latest. And sometimes maybe it's also good to invert that or to use small budgets to your advantage and reuse openly past work. So the first project I wanted to talk to you about is Liverpool biennial, and this is not the logo I designed. This was the previous logo, and I've been working for them since 2012. And it's an art biennial, so it happens every 2 years. So every 2 years, you kind of re-question what you've done and how you can update it. We ended up living in Liverpool for 1.5 years. It's where my daughter was born, Josephine. She's a Scouser. What's really important in Liverpool is the football, and for some reason that kind of seeped into the identity that we did because it was very present in the city. And so we started off just with a simple typeface. It was before even thinking we'd make an identity. It was just the edition of 2012. And I had wanted to use Albertus and red, but when the board saw that, they freaked out and they said, we have to represent both football teams. So we chose a typeface, Barcelona by Benguiat, which felt a little bit similar to Albertus, but quite different enough. And the color red for the first edition. And we thought it'd be nice to because this biennial was going to be in different places in the city that were unoccupied, like classical buildings. So we decided to do a photography campaign documenting people in these spaces. So the one on the left is the Cunard building. It's like a beautiful old shipping site from where the Titanic left to America. And on the right, is an old sorting post office. And these are some of the sites where the art biennial would take place. And you always put like a little red figure somewhere in the distance. And this is then some of the signage, pretty simple, that we installed around the city, and how that looked with the graphics on top. And then in 2012, 2014, 2 years later, by then they had asked, oh, can we keep it and can it become our identity? Kind of cheeky because they didn't pay for an identity and it became one. But anyway, we kept it. And of course, what you do, you choose a new color, but we kind of felt like maybe the images were not so successful, they were a bit cheesy and a bit depressing looking, but the problem always is when you make an art exhibition, you can't put one artist on the poster, especially when a lot of them are making new work, because you don't want to foreground them. So we decided to choose typography as an image. And that's what it became. So they were really keen on using the title of the exhibition, which was A Needle Walks into a Haystack. And we chose Marianne by Joseph Churchward and tried to make a kind of image with a type. And the theme of the biennial then was also daily life and people's normal habits and relationships and activities. So it was meant to have a kind of friendly, approachable, almost comic style feeling. And we used the technique to then start playing around with it, making arrow piles, or even words, just inventing words to be able to make a stack, or animating it. And then the 2016 was a really complicated year because there was a faculty of curators who wanted to do episodes, and it was not really one theme, but lots of different themes like the future, childhood, all kinds of things. So rather than having the identity and then a kind of sub-identity for the biennial, we tried to merge the two together and try to merge the image kind of almost into the identity. So we worked with these dingbats to replace letters. Like that. And then this year, it's still on the Liverpool Biennial. If you live in England, it's definitely worth a visit. We tried to push that idea of merging the image and the text even further. And it was nice to see Matthew Carter's talk on Thursday, because we invited Paul Elliman to work with us on the identity. He's an artist who's been working on this collection of fonts, letters that he finds for many, many years. And it's called the Day Shapes. It's a kind of an artwork. And this is Paul when he came to Liverpool. So he went around Liverpool collecting just bits on the floor in which you can recognize letters. And then we worked on some compositions together. So the title of the biennial was Beautiful World, Where Are You? It kind of responds to today's climate. And yeah. He was very particular of the placement and how things would be set on the page. This is another project that's been actually my second longest project. It's Wheels. I show it to you because it's in Belgium and you're in Belgium and maybe you want to go visit it. It's an art center in Brussels. They have a beautiful exhibition of René Daniel's paintings at the moment. But in 2006, I won the competition to design their logo and identity, and I've been working with them ever since. And this is the building where it's housed. It was derelict at the time. And the logo that we made is based on the building. So there's a kind of E in the building, and this was the logo. And there's a little booklet that describes how the identity came into being. And together with Jo, we made a typeface for it, only one weight, because there was no budget at the time. called Wheels Bolts, and it was based on Marcel Brotaer's vacuum plastic artworks, and also on Belgium road signs. But since we were stuck with this one weight, and I've been kind of bastardizing the typeface myself, so we've been trying to kind of almost kill the identity or something by making lots of different versions over the years. So it's been now more than 10 years that we've been working on this. Yeah, this is the latest. I'm sure the type designers, you will all like cry when you see this, but this is, I did this myself, like a chopped off extra bold version for the show that's on at the moment. And this is the last one in the series of really long-running projects, and it's for Camden Art Centre in London, and that's been since 15 years. Now we've been making these booklets, so whenever you go to Camden Art Centre, you can buy one of these. It costs maybe £1, and it's a set, so you can collect them in this binder. And it's together with James Goggin that we do this, and it uses his typeface Helix and Century School book. And so it's a set size, the tab always changes, and the type is the same, but we try and change the paper and the way the images are placed in response to the artwork. So the second category is other people's legacy in your own work and how you deal with that. And in 2008, Catherine Dixon invited me to give a talk at St. Bride Library, and it was about inspiration. And instead of showing lots of images of what inspired me, I tried to kind of reenact a moment of feeling inspired. And giving this talk was a bit of a breakthrough moment in a way, because I had gone to the biennial library one afternoon, and I typed in women and graphic design, and the only thing I found was this talk by John Dreyfus on Beatrice Ward, but it was in the V&A, so there were no slides. We did only this photocopied manuscript. And so I studied graphic design, and I had never heard of Beatrice Ward at that time. Can you believe it? And this is examples of how the slides were described. So for the talk, I cut out all the subtitles and only projected this, so you would have to imagine what the images look like. And I've been going back to this talk over the years, and it's really helped me think about legacy, or how people are remembered, and in what power it is the people who are left behind have over other people's legacy. Like, this is a man describing a woman's practice, and he's at one hand describing her work, but then he goes into her hair and the naked drawings Eric Gill made of her. And only when I found the slides then in St. Bride many years later for a talk at iMagazine, and I saw the slides, I realized how shocking it is, and how much of a responsibility you have as a graphic designer or a type designer for other people's legacy, I guess. Even the way maybe she's depicted in images like this, always in relation to another man who is the active person. So maybe it's nice to think about talking about her work, or having her own words, which we found and are now on Type Radio, where you can hear her speak in her own voice. Those kind of things are really important. I run a small press called Occasional Papers, and it's together with my partner, Anthony Rudek, who's a design historian, an art historian. And when we got together in 2007, we thought, what would be nice to do together as an art historian and a designer, and we thought making books would be ideal. And we both felt there were not enough books in both our disciplines that celebrate people that are forgotten, or that were maybe not so good at promoting themselves when they were alive. And when we were thinking about setting up the press, there was this exhibition on in London of Ken Briggs in Pump House Gallery, which was a tiny, tiny space in South London. And a friend of mine, Fraser Muggeridge, said, "Oh, there's this beautiful show, you gotta go see it, we have to do something about it because nobody knows about it." And so we decided, Anthony and I had been dreaming of setting up these occasional papers, to use that as a starting point for our press. So in 2 weeks' time, the show was still on. In 2 weeks' time, we went to interview Ken, who was then still alive. We transcribed the interview, edited the interview, designed it, and printed it so that we could have a book launch at the end for the opening. And these are some images of his work. He designed a lot for the National Theatre. He was one of the first people to bring graphic design into Britain. Swiss graphic design, Swiss style in the 60s. He was one of the first people to use it. And I'd like to just have you listen to a tiny snippet of Ken speaking, because I think it says a lot about this thing, what I was talking about legacy.
And one of the students did say, "Why don't you give a talk about what we do?" And so I did. And I tried to flit it through very quickly, and there was an outcry. They said, "For Christ's sake, let's look at the bloody thing before you switch off." So I had to go back again. And I just found it too embarrassing, really. And then there was another occasion when I had to talk my way through it. I found it just too much.
Yeah, he's saying how, he didn't like talking about his work or doing what I'm doing now. And those are the people that maybe get left behind or get forgotten. So with occasional papers, those are the people we're interested in, people who don't fit a particular mold or, so that's a little booklet we made. And from that period on, I've been maybe more aware of history and graphic design. And it's been really amazing to see in type design how type design has been around for such a long time. So the type legacy is kind of part of it, and it seems so natural to you. But like in graphic design is not such an old discipline, I guess, and there isn't that much graphic design history being done. So in 2012, together with the design historian, 2011, Catherine de Smet, we organized a conference on graphic design history at St. Bride Library as a fundraiser. And
hi, my name is Steve Heller, and I am not a design historian.
Lots of people spoke about graphic design history today, but what was one of the most exciting outcomes for me was working with Catherine on it. I learned a lot from her, and we realized that there wasn't really a book on graphic design historiography. So not case studies of graphic design histories, but articles that discuss how to do history, how to do graphic design history. And so we made a kind of compilation of articles. And the first one is only from quite recent, I think it's in the 80s, from Massimo Vignelli, saying, "Guys, we really need to do something about our history." And I showed this recently to an art historian, and this is the book. And she couldn't believe it, that all the writing in English we could find on graphic design historiography could fit into one single book. This is another example of a project by Occasional Papers. At the time I was teaching at a Royal College, and Rick Poyner was also a tutor there. And there was a small exhibition of Thompson Wester of his work on in Norwich, which we had seen. And Rick Poyner also, I started talking to Rick about him, and Rick was like, he's amazing, I love him, blah, blah. So Thompson Wester was, this is a picture of him. He was a Benedictine monk, but also a concrete poet. So this is him with the Dalai Lama in the monastery, and this is him doing the dishes. But this is him when he would go down to London on the train and change his clothes in his art world clothes. And he had a cell in his monastery where he had an Olivetti typewriter, and he made these most amazing typestracts, he called them. So just by typing, he'd make these compositions. And he saw it as a way of meditating, of praying. He was also a Buddhist. And so we got in touch with Nicola, who was doing her PhD on him, and decided to put our heads together, also with Rick and with other people who knew him at the time, to try and make a book. And rather than making the big book that everybody is dying to see, Occasional Papers always tries to make affordable books. So maybe it's not complete, maybe there are other bigger experts out there, but with some people like Thompson Wester, it's important to just get something out into the world, which is what we felt was necessary. And so that's what we did. And he kind of became forgotten because at some point his boss in the monastery said, "You got to stop going to all these art world parties," and he did. He totally retreated and became a monk. So that's why his practice became a bit forgotten. And whenever we make a book, we also try to do launches so that we can talk about it and that there is a kind of a broader discussion around it. And at the launch of the Thompson Wester book, the grandson of a friend of Thompson Wester, Bob Coby, was a friend, and his grandson, William Coby, came up and said, "Hey, I have some Thompson Wester stuff in my grandfather's archive. Maybe you'd be interested. He's recently died and we don't know what to do with it. We have to clear out his flat." And that's Bob Coby, the guy with the beard, and William Coby is the guy in the front. And Bob Coby was also a concrete poet, but he called himself a sound poet. So his typography is very much based on sound, and he would perform it as well. He was also in a band.
Rust, moth, fungus, mildew, dry rot, canker, maggot, worm, wriggle.
I'll just show you some of his work. So he also ran a bookshop. He was part of Writers' Forum. He was involved with the anti-university, and he was politically very active. And so again, that's one of the reasons why his practice became a bit forgotten, because he wasn't a person who just made the same thing over and over and went to promote it everywhere. He was a very giving, very widespread personality who helped people produce their work. He would help people make little zines and things like that. So what we're also trying to do is maybe try and open the discipline a bit, not be too focused on purely graphic design, but not question where it starts and ends. And this is an example of how to deal with other people's legacy in your own work as a graphic designer. Nottingham Contemporary is an art center in England, in Nottingham. And after I did Wheels, they asked me to do their identity. And the building is a new building by Caruso and John at the time. And it's the pattern with lace, because lace in Nottingham was a really important industry. And here's a picture, a detail of it. And I thought rather than going into the lace obsession and emphasize the building and the architecture of the building as with Wheels, it would be nice to do some research into maybe the typographic history of Nottingham. So I went to meet this guy, Albert Haynes, who was a printer in Nottingham and who had a big archive in his attic. Unfortunately, I forgot the name of his wife. And I also went again to St. Bride's to look at these examples of printing in the early 30s in University College Nottingham, where we found this beautiful, elegant, grotesque typeface that they used over and over again. So Jo and I, Jo de Baardemaker and me, digitized the typeface for the identity. Here's the inline version, and here it is in use. There is no logo for the art center, but it's an open-ended platform. The logo is meant to be an exhibition space, so all the weird squigglies are actually logos made by artists. This is an example of, this is Edward Krasinski, who's a really amazing Polish avant-garde artist who was obsessed by this blue tape that he put on everything, also in his studio. And we made a book about his work. So we thought it'd be nice to try and do this thing that he did also in the typeface. Interieur is a design fair in Belgium which has been going since the 60s. Baudouin de Lare was the designer of it, of the very first one. And he drew this letter word by hand. And in 2010, we were asked to design their identity of the fair. It's a huge interior design fair. And the only rule that they said was you have to use this logo. And this is Baudouin in the 70s in his studio. And I'm sorry for the bad quality, but these are some of the posters that he'd done. And so I went to meet him, because often you get invited as a designer to come and do something, and you don't even look at what's gone before you. You just kind of try and put your own ego out there. But I think it's nice to maybe look at what's gone before you and build on it, rather than do the tabula rasa. So we decided to take his identity, his word, and to try and make a typeface from it. So I worked together with Sueli Tan, and we did lots of tests, and ended up with this one. And then we tried to use his very flat graphics, but maybe make them a bit more three-dimensional, so we worked with gradients. So every single thing we made was just a different gradient, and then the same typeface. And this one's a giant split tuck. It's like we put all the different inks into the press, and so it's all the fluoros. So at the beginning, the invite was beautiful, different fluoro colors, and at the end, like a weird brown mush. And this one is silver and gold that we put together on the press. And these are the the notebooks. And then we also did a giant walkway around the fair of colors, like a gradient. Just we through that. And then Baudouin kind of liked it, and we're still friends. I go and see him quite regularly. He just turned 80. But a few years after that, I was invited to design the identity for Art Brussels, which is an art fair here in Brussels. They now have another one. And the art fair was, at that time, held at the Hazel. Again, a tourism tip, if you're here for a while. This building still stands. It's the Atomium. It's Expo 58 World Fair, the Belgian pavilion. And so since the art fair was taking place every year on the site of the Atomium of the World Expo, I thought it'd be nice to make a reference in the visual identity to the typographic history of the site. And Expo 58's identity was designed by this guy, Lucien de Rook, who taught at La Cambre. And he made this beautiful 58 typography. So similarly to Baudouin, without even asking it, thinking about it, Lucien de Rook has died. I thought, wouldn't it be nice to update it, make a typeface from it? And we did, and it was in use. But unfortunately, we forgot to ask the estate, who were very angry because they thought we were ripping him off. So it can sometimes be also too naive, I think, in dealing with other people's history. And they were totally right. We should have asked them if it was okay, because we were using his work. So sometimes legacy can have problems, I guess. And then the last few examples I want to show you are examples of my research. So, I'm doing this PhD. I still have 4 years to go. I've only been doing it for 2 years, and it's a PhD in the art, which means it's not like an art historical PhD, but it's about my practice. My practice is part of it. But slowly, it's been narrowing down on graphic design in the 60s and 70s in Belgium that crosses disciplines. And that's kind of because of the examples I've been showing you of Baudouin and Lucien de Rook. Those are things that are interesting to me in my work. on the one hand, and on the other hand, because there's absolutely nothing that exists on this period. There is one book and a few articles, and that's it. There's absolutely no publication on Belgian graphic design history. It's really shocking. And the person I've been seeing the most is called Paul Ibu. I thought you might find that funny in the type conference. He's kind of anti-words. He's really into pictograms. That's his slogan that he types at himself. And he's like the man in Belgium in that period. He lives in Antwerp. He's still alive. And he designs hundreds of logos. He's like the Belgian Paul Rand, in a way. But why I'm so interested by him is, again, nobody knows about this guy outside of Belgium. And even within Belgium, very few people these days still do. And what's interesting about him is that he calls himself a multi-artist. So he doesn't see himself only as a graphic designer, but he's also a painter and also a publisher and a sculptor and a constructivist, and he has a long list of things. And I wanted to show you this, which is a book he designed in '67, and it's a beautiful metal foil-blocked box. It's called Metamorphosis, and it's completely blank die-cut book. And he said it was just like a baby that had to be born. It's something that he made himself. And it's just interleaved with different sheets of Perspex color. So, yeah, these are some sheets of that. And these are some examples of his work. Again, like I had no idea of the stuff he'd done until I started digging in the archives. This is in '71 in Beaux-Arts. He made this facade, and he used die cutting a lot in his work. And this is him together with his partner, Lilian Emma Staal, who was actually a major influence in his practice, even though he doesn't maybe... she's deceased a few years ago, and maybe it's not so clear, but she was his assistant. And she ran a space called Multiart. So in 1970, they decided to start in Antwerp a press called Multiart, where they would, their idea was to make small objects in print runs of 100 that you could, made out of paper, that you could put on your shelf at home and buy for not too much money and dispose of. It's a kind of democratic artwork for your home kind of press. And they found some backers and managed to wrangle them for some money for a space that they ran in Antwerp for two to 3 years, called Multiart, and Paul designed the logo. And it's amazing how Lilian gets left out of the story, but I think she was the central person running it and doing it, because when you go back and read all the press releases, it's her name that's under it. So that's her at the opening. And they were quite successful, the events. And these are some of the objects that they produced. So this is one of the calendars, Paul Ibu's. It's a die-cut calendar. And the one on the left is by artist Paul van Hooijdonk, and it's a city, so you can put boxes in it and move them and change them. It's in Chromolux card. And on the right, it's a rotating object by two architects, Lothauber Grazma. This is a nose book that I made with different faces you could swap around. This one is an interactive book where you're supposed to... it starts as a white booklet, and then you're supposed to do things with it, cut it, wrinkle it, tear it, burn it, soak it in water. And the one on the right, there are different blocks that you can change around and make your own kind of configuration of colors with it. And what's so amazing about Ibu's practice also, that it's very three-dimensional. So this is the design of a logo, for example, where you actually built this thing, and it's for the National Ballet of... the National Ballet, and had people dance in it and then photographed it and used it as a logo. So this is his shelf in his studio, where you see his artworks and his logos all melding together. I'm very interested in that. Another person that I've been fascinated by is called Corneille Hanosse. Again, I had to dig so hard to even find his work. There's nothing written anywhere about this guy. And yet, what you're looking at is the invitation of Marcel Brotaars, where he announced, "Me too, I want to be an artist and make some money in the world." And this invitation sells for €1,000 on the internet. It's in the MoMA collection, and yet Corneille Hanosse is not mentioned, is rarely mentioned, yet his name is printed on the invite, so you know he did it. So I managed to track down his archive, and his daughter, who is still alive. These are some images of his work. He also was part of Cobra, the beginnings of Cobra. So he worked a lot with, this is with Christian Dotremont, for example, an invitation card. And he was a very keen photographer. So he's again one of these people that's not only a graphic designer. So he traveled a lot and was really obsessed with patterns. And there's hundreds and hundreds of these kind of very graphic photographs that he then used in his work. And he worked for Beaux-Arts a lot. And this is for 30 years he designed these booklets. He was one of the co-founders of the Museum of Cinema in Belgium. So he designed also their interiors, their furniture, but also their graphics. So this is a chair he made. Some 3D poster displays. And this is Herman Lampaert, another person. He's still alive, and I'm interested in him because he's more of a he's the person who wrote the only book on Belgian graphic design history, and he's more of a thinker and a writer and a teacher than a graphic designer. But I really love this poster and some of this. And I'm desperate to find some women, and they're really hard to find, actually. But this is the work of Janine Behagel, who has deceased. I'm trying to track down her work. And yeah, I also found out that there used to be a house of graphic designers in Belgium where they had a bar called the Recto Verso Bar. Anyway, I can go on and on and on. But in 1 year's time, in the Design Museum in Ghent, there'll be a kind of display of some of this stuff I've been finding. And I'm trying to... It's going to be kind of a personal selection, so maybe to come back to the theme of legacy is trying to be honest about what you do with a legacy and not trying to present it as a kind of neutral or objective fact, this legacy, but something that we need to work with and do stuff with, or try and interpret, and maybe it's okay to sometimes show it in a subjective way also. So there's the end of my cake. Thank you very much.